Okay, Boker Tov. Welcome to the last day of Bava Batra and of the Bavas. And we pick up on the Gemara right after the Mishnah on Kuf Ayin Ham with Bet, 175b. Amar Ula. So the Mishnah just talked about the fact that what we've been assuming for a long time, that debts written with documents, shtarchov, are debts that have liens, debts that are just oral with witnesses, but there are no written documents. There are no liens. And then there was a whole discussion about when the guarantor, the Arav, signs at the bottom after the witness is signed. The Mishnah says that he might be obligated, but there are no liens on his property, on the guarantor's property. And Banana said he's not even obligated. So let's see with a very colorful sort of analogy in at the end of the Mishnah. So let's see the Gemara. Amar Ula, Dvar Torah, as far from the Torah's perspective, that there would really be liens you could collect from encumbered property, whether it was with a document or whether it was only oral, meaning only witnesses but no written evidence, no written document. My time, what's the reason? Shibuda Geraisa.
Not if there are no witnesses.
No, maybe even if there are no witnesses. I mean, the guy could deny it, and certainly the Lakuchos could deny it. Okay, but at least in principle, right, he's not even requiring that. Liens are from the Torah. The loan creates the reality of liens. You don't need any other instrument to create the reality of liens. So it must be the rabbis changed this. So what would have motivated the rabbis to say that without a shtar, that you're only going to be able to collect from unencumbered property directly from the lova and not from people that he sold to? So Mishum Pseda de Lukuchos, to protect the people that purchased the property from him. Okay, but it's the rabbis coming in and protecting the purchasers and saying it's not fair to them if there's no written evidence and no record and no way in which they could find out.
Also not fair to Mala.
All right, Ihachi, fine. Ihachi, Mala b'shtar nami. So even with a written document, let's protect them. So the Gemara says, no, Hasam inu ninu diafsidu b'anafshayu. No, they sort of they brought the loss upon themselves. They could have had ways to have found out. Okay, but so this point of departure, I mean, everybody agrees to the logic, which is the logic is a written document people could find out, and therefore they have a responsibility to find out, and they should be aware. If it's not a written, then that's not reasonable to expect that of them. But the question is, what is your point of departure, and what's motivating you? So from this perspective, the reality of the loan creates the liens. What's motivating the rabbis to step in is to protect the Lakuchos. They see a need to do that when there is no written document, but not a need to do that when there is a written document. Let's just wait to hear the other side of it. Okay, that's what Ula says. The Rabbi Amar, and Rabbi says no. As far as the Torah is concerned, whether in a shtar and whether oral, you can only get from the lovet. There's no reality of liens. Now, by the way, Tosfos points out, Rabbi might not just be saying by default that's the way it is. Rabbi might be saying that even were you to write directly in the document, I, Michael, am borrowing from Dov, or we testify that Michael borrowed from Dov $10,000, and Michael agreed to have his property encumbered. Okay, and the Dov should have liens. It could be from the Torah that does nothing. Because maybe the idea of liens, not just because we care about the people that are going to buy the property and it's not fair to them, but the concept that such a phenomenon, a legal instrument should exist, a legal reality that I have a right to this property even after somebody else has bought it. Michael could sell his property, he could give his property to me, but maybe there's no legal, there's no phenomenon of this thing called a lien, that I have a right to the property which will allow me to collect it from somebody else after they've bought it from Michael. So, no matter how much you tried, maybe the Torah doesn't even recognize it. All I have a right to do is to collect from Michael.
Well, you say it's somewhat of a halfway. You don't have a right in your Torah to collect from somebody else, but you have a right to collect my property.
Yeah, okay, we're not discussing that. B'nei Chor means I have a right to collect the property under your control, but no liens, nothing that would enable me to collect it once it's sold to somebody else. Okay, so that would be from the Torah's perspective. So why, therefore, did the rabbis come in and institute this thing called liens and do it with a shtar? So So the flip side of protecting the people that would purchase Michael's lands is to not lock the door in front of people to lend money. It's hard enough in halacha to lend money. There's like only negative incentives to lend money unless you're operating with like a heterisk or something. So therefore the rabbis had to do things to encourage people to lend money. So if I want to get my money back, the rabbis had to give me some liens on Michael's property to ensure that I could get the money back after he sold his property. So the Gemara says, if that's true, milval pen nami. So let's give lenders, even without a star, the right. Let's give them liens so that they can get their money back. So the Gemara says, hasam leis lakala. No, there's no voice. There's nobody knows about it. And again, meaning there, the Peseda Dulukuchos concern would kick in. And as to the claim, and by the way, since the whole incentive is to make it easier for me to lend money. Once I have an option available to me, right with a star, we don't have to give me all the options, right? We just say, right with a star, and therefore, it'll go ahead and, and I have the way of doing it and protecting myself. Maybe there's a question about who pays for the star. We actually had that discussion earlier. You get the borrowers to pay for the star, then that makes it that much more of a, of a removal of an obstacle, since there's an option for me to lend money and to know that I'll have liens. Yes.
I mean, you're right that does the Malveh have rights to just the person's, I can go either way, cash, not the property, or property, not the cash?
No, so there's a little bit of a hint to that in the Rashbam, but I'm going to go with Tosfos. Tosfos assumes no. Even if Shibuda's Lavdil right, though, all that means is this type of a right that would allow me to collect once the property isn't in the person's hands. But as long as the property is in the person's hands, whether Shibuda is the rights or not the rights or whatever, that's all part of the fact that you owe me money. Okay, and you owe me money now, now. Of course, there is an interesting issue the Gemara discusses. Does you owe me money mean, therefore, I can compel you to pay with what any property you have, land property, your automobile, your baseball cards, whatever, but ultimately it's through your personal obligation to me, and I can compel you to pay from any of your property. You don't need the idea of liens there, but that's the nature of your obligation to me. Or does it mean, remember the Gemara introduced the idea the other day, the idea of arevut, that your property is like your guarantor. So let's say you're off in France or whatever. I'm not compelling you. I'm just going to the Beis Din, and they're letting me go into your house and take my collection. So that is a right to your property, maybe as a type of a guarantor, but still, it's not going to the point of liens, which is a right to do it once it's in somebody else's hands. But you're right. Conceptually, there are three levels. Okay, there's the Lova's obligation directly to me, which means that I can bring him to court and they can pay cash, or maybe I can compel him to pay anything. But that's at least when I'm engaging the Lova, right? Then there is, the Lova is alive, but he's not present. Okay, and in that type of a case, but still the Lova's property, and in that type of case, can I go straight to the property? So that maybe is an idea of liens, but maybe that's an idea, like the Gemara said before, of like that they're his guarantors, and then the idea of liens is, can I take the property when it's in somebody else's possession? That somebody else could be a person he sold it to, could be his heirs, but they're completely, it's not in the context of my relationship with the Lova, and the property is not even any longer the Lova. And that seems to be the case we're focusing on.
There's also Bacho and Benoni, there's like what kind of property?
Yeah, all those are different considerations.
One last question, I'm trying to about sometimes we say late like Kala, but how does that I guess harmonize or not with like other things we see in the Gemara, like Chaver to Islay, Chaver Islay.
So the Gemara discusses that. It depends on also like the difference between, by the way, of a about if somebody's on my property, whether I hear about somebody being on my property has to do with the fact that people know it's relevant to me, so they know to report it to me. Whereas if you borrowed money from me, people don't know to report it to Hanan. Why would people tell Hanan about that? Okay, and now Hanan wants to buy property from you. So he wasn't yet a person of interest that the message should get to him. But anyway, there are different types of fish. Whatever, there are different types of, maybe, but not all rumors are everybody is like clued into, and not all rumors are as juicy as other rumors. Yes.
Well, we were discussing an example yesterday where the oral contract really didn't have any rights to claim the land.
No. Well, that's what sort of little Michael was discussing before. It might be that the person is believed to say he paid up. Right. Okay, but that's different from whether I have shibudim, right? I could have shibudim, but it'll be a moot point if the guy just lies and says he paid it up. Or it could be that the purchasers would be in a position to say, like, like prove to me that you lent that money if I don't have witnesses. Because how can you come collect it from me? I don't care that the lova admits he borrowed the money. That's not good enough to make me give you the property. You're going to have to bring objective evidence. So all those are things to consider. But if you have that type of evidence, the question still would be, would there be shibudim without the written document? Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Now, did Rabbi really say this, that from the Torah's perspective, there are no loans, no liens, excuse me. The Hamar Rabba, didn't Rabba say, Gabu karka is yeshlo, Gabu mos ainlo. So now the Gemara is going, it's like a little pop quiz at the end of the Masechet to see how much you remember from things we discussed before. So here's a discussion about when does a Bechor get a double portion? So, of course, you all remember the principle that Ein HaBechor Noto Pishnayim Karoi B'Muchza. That a Bechor, you see, Michael remembers it, so Michael gets an A. So, a Bechor does not get a double portion on things that were coming into the estate, only things that the father had before he died. So, the big question is, what about outstanding debts? Outstanding debts that get paid after the father died. Does the Bechor get double or not? Is that like that was already money in the estate? So, Rabbah said it depends how those debts were paid up. If those debts were paid up with land, then it's like that was always in the estate and the Bechor gets double. If they were paid up with cash, then it's new money coming into the estate. So what's the logical difference? Either way, it was money owed and then it was finally paid. The only logic to say that the land is like it was always part of the estate and the Bechor gets double is if you think there's an idea of shibud and that there's a reality of a lien, and therefore that lien creates it like that land, the estate already had its clause into that land, and maybe it was already like in the process of taking full possession of it. Okay, now that makes sense if shibud is d'oraita, but if it's rabbinic, why should the Bechor on the basis of this principle get double? Okay, so the Gemara says, maybe I should reverse it. Maybe with money he gets double, because that's like a reversal. Money was lent, money was paid back. It's like it was always there. But with karka not, in order to make Rabbah consistent with what he said, okay, the Gemara says no, because we also have a challenge with Ula. Maybe not only reverse the Bechor ruin, reverse the Rabbah and Ula positions here, or whether liens are d'oraita. No, because we have another evidence that shows that Ula holds, like he says here, that liens are from the Torah. How do you know that? V'amar Ula, Dvar Torah, Balchov, Dina b'ziboris. That from the Torah's perspective, a Balchov gets from grade C property. Now, how does that prove that Ula holds that there are liens in the Torah? So the Rashbam says, well, because he's getting property. But Tosos says, and this gets back to Michael's question before, but that could mean when he's getting property from directly the lova. When I'm forcing Michael to pay, and Michael has property in his name, can I go to the court and say, I want his best property? And Ula says, no, Michael's entitled to give you his worst property. But that's not a proof of a lien. That's just Michael owes me the money. That's not telling you what happens when the land gets sold elsewhere. So Tosos doesn't really know why the Gemara thinks that this is proof that Ula holds of such an idea of liens. The Rashbam thinks that the concept of liens is relevant even when I'm directly collecting from Michael. Maybe anything I'm getting from Michael that isn't cash shows a direct right to his property. That seems to be the way the Rashbam understands it. Okay, but for whatever reason, the Gemara thinks that this is proof that Ula holds that there are liens in the Torah. Okay, so clearly Rabbah holds there aren't. So if Rabbah holds there aren't liens in the Torah, why, when you collect property, does the Bechor get a double portion? So the Gemara says, Rabba time of the Bnei Ma'arava kamar v'leilo svirle. Yeah, Rabba over there was explaining the position of Bnei Ma'arava. That was a discussion there about what did Bnei Ma'arava say. When does the Bechor get double? When he doesn't. So Rabba was explaining their position, but he himself would not hold that. He would not hold that karka gives you more right than money when it comes to the Bechor. Now, I do want to pause for a moment.
Gabu karka
that idea of Gabu karka, the Bechor gets double, was explaining Bnei Ma'arava. Wasn't his position. Now, I want to just pause for a moment and say, excuse me. It is interesting that the Gemara thinks here that there would be a practical difference between Rabbah and Ula, because you could say what they're all debating is just a historical theoretical discussion, right? But practically, once the rabbis instituted, in this case you have liens, in this case you don't, whether they're giving liens that the Torah didn't give, or whether they're taking away liens that the Torah gave, at the end of the day, we all agree that the same legal system obtains, right? There's no maybe residue of that difference. It seems like the Gemara understands that if you understand that the liens are from the Torah, somehow conceptually they are more powerful than if those liens were only given to you from the rabbis, right? Because so if they were liens from the Torah and then the estate collected it, it's like the estate always had it and the bechor gets double. But if the liens were only from the rabbis and the estate collected it, it would not be like the estate always had it. It's not so obvious why that's true. Okay, one interesting way to conceptualize this difference, and I should mention this as well because it gets to something the Gemara isn't saying, but a way to understand the power of a shtar in creating liens is how much do you conceptualize liens as a partial ownership in the land or a right in the land itself, and I'm exercising my ownership of the land, my right, under these conditions, and now it's like this land was always mine and so on, or, whatever, it was always like I had my clause in that land, or is it just an abstract right, but it's not a sense of a partial ownership of the land itself. And if you think of it as a partial ownership of the land itself, then that could be what a shtar does, because a shtar is a way of transferring land. So maybe the shtar chov, what it does is it transfers the rights in the property and creates a partial ownership of that property. So the way some achronim explain it, this isn't in the Gemara, but the Gemara all makes about whether you're protecting the borrowers or not protecting the borrowers. But they say that there's two ways of conceptualizing liens. Just an abstract right. Michael owes me money. That gives me a right to go to Hanan. That doesn't seem really fair to Hanan. Why is the fact that he owes me money and I have some right lets me go to property he owes? It's much easier to understand it if we say all along I had a certain right to that land, and when he bought it with my rights already present in that land. But if you understand it that way, then you could sort of say that maybe that's what the shtar helps me do. The shtar is a way of transferring land and therefore transferring rights to land. Okay, so maybe that has to do also with this difference of whether shibud was doraita or whether it was created from the rabbis. How sort of deep you feel my shibud is, because here it's clear that one thinks that whether it's doraita or dorabanan would have a practical, legal implication in terms of this issue of bechor.
Then based on that, what kind of property it was? Was he bore it or bait on it or eat it?
What do you mean?
If the Baal was go with it,
yeah.
And you sold Hanan like grade A property, then
right. Well, that's true anyway, but that's not relevant to this question. I mean, however the Chazal limited it, that's how they limited it. Yes.
Property taxes. Like if the tax collector.
Oh, yeah. Well, there was from the government, not from halacha.
Right.
That would be a question about what the government would, how the secular government would conceptualize this. Okay. So now the Gemara says like this. Okay. Now, okay. Rav and Shmuel Dami Tavai. Now, Rav and Shmuel both say, Malval Pa'in Agava Lomina Yoshim Lomina Lakuchos. Now we're going to see another way in which they use this question of is it from the Torah, from the rabbis, with a practical legal implication. They both say that if it's an oral loan, you don't get either from the heirs or from the buyers. Why? My time is shibud alav doraita. The shibud isn't doraita. It only exists where the rabbis created it, and they only created it when there's a written document, when there's a shtar. So the point is, you don't even get it from the heirs, right? Now think for a moment. You can't force the heirs to pay their father's debt if there is no written document. Now, if you think about it, if basically we're only trying to protect, really, by the fact that you have a loan gives you shibudim, gives you liens. But the rabbis, to protect the innocent purchasers, said we'll erase them when there's no written document. Well, that shouldn't apply to a case of heirs, because the heirs aren't people that are choosing to buy the property and putting out their own money to buy the property. They're just, receiving it. So since they're just receiving it, and I actually have those liens, and I put out money and lent the money, and I want to get my loan paid up, then I should be able to collect from the heirs. That's if you were to say that shibud is deoraita, right? Then therefore, there's no reason to protect the heirs, and therefore, even if it was just an oral loan, I should be able to collect. But if you say that shibud is not deoraita, and the rabbis came ahead and instituted it why did they institute it? Oh, to encourage me to lend money. Then I had the option of writing a shtar, and I should have written a shtar in the first place. And because that's what they gave me to encourage me. And if I didn't write a shtar, and I was willing to risk my right to collect it from the purchasers, then I've also given up my right to collect it from the heirs. So that's what they say. Okay, so let's read that again. Rav and Shmuel Dami Tavai, Milva Peh, if it's oral, can't even get it from the heirs. You can't get it from the Lukuchos, obviously. My time is Shibud Alav Deraisa. It's not from the Torah. We only created it when there was a written document to encourage people to lend money. You chose not to use the written document. You lost out, and you can't even collect it from the heirs. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon Lucky, they both say, but they go the opposite direction, which is not what our Mishnah teaches. Like, it's crazy. This is against everything we've ever learned. They're saying you can get it even from purchasers if there's no written document. Okay, my time is Shibud Deraisa. It's Doraita, and the rabbis actually didn't do anything to interfere with it. Okay, so this is the actual nice middle ground position is not being said here. The logical middle ground position is, if it's al peh, you can't collect from the lekuchos because they're not protected, but you can collect from the heirs because there's no need to protect the heirs. And that makes a lot of sense if shibuda is d'oraita. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are going to the extreme, and they're saying that you can always collect from lekuchos even without a written document. That's nothing we've ever said before. Let's see what the Gemara does with this. Meisvei says, I'll ask about this. Somebody is digging a well in Rishut Rabim. So Ruvain there is at the bottom of the well that he is illegally digging in the public thoroughfare. The Nafal Shor V'Harago, and an ox walks into the pit, falls down, and kills him in the process. Putter, the owner of the ox is exempt from paying any damages or kofar. Not only that, the low owed. Elishim Mace, if Ruvain died in the process, Hashur, excuse me, that's a good point. If the ox died, Ruvain we're going to assume is dead. If the ox died, Balabur Chayam L'Shalim. The heirs of Ruvain's kids have to pay the owners of the ox to make sure the Balav. Okay, so now that's a very nice, colorful case. I'm sure you'll go on and you'll remember that. The ox that falls on the guy and his heirs have to pay the owner of the ox. But the point is, why do they have to pay? That's a milval peh. There's no written document. What? Not a milval, it's a choval peh. Okay, which, by the way, is another interesting nafkamina that we haven't discussed, which is if the whole purpose of creating it was do you have liens when you're not dealing with loans, right? So Tosa sort of says yes, but again, that could have been something we could have explored. But the Gemara is assuming that any debt is the same. Okay, now you could have again challenged that. If the whole reason is Shalotino Delis, maybe we don't create liens even with written documents when it's not in the context of loans. But we're going to bracket that. Okay, and we're going to assume debts and loans are all the same. So now, but why can you collect money from the heirs? Okay, why? Because there's no written document. So if you say that that's a question according to, I guess, Rav and Shmuel, because Rav and Shmuel says you can't collect from the heirs without a written document. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ilah, Amar Rav, B'Shamad B'Din. So the case is the Ruvain didn't die right away. They took Ruvain to a court case for their ox, and there he was in the hospital bed, but they took him to the court case, and then he died later. And since Beis Din paskind it, that's like a written document. That's a public thing, and that's like a written document. So the Gemara says, "V'hahar go ktani," but it says they said they killed Ruvain. Amarav the ox. Amarav Amarava. Chasol treifa. Yeah. Whatever. They fatally wounded him, and then he died later. It's like that Monty Python skit, right? I'm not dead yet. Okay, so there he was. He wasn't dead yet, and then they got them, and then they had it dead, and therefore it was like they got a written document. V'amarav Nachman Tanitana Mace. Vikivro. What do you mean it? But Rav Nachman said that the Tana teaches Ruvain died and the ox buried him in the process. Like the ox fell on him in the well and they just left it in the well. And they buried him there in the well. So the Gemara says, yeah, but there was a Beis Din sitting right at the edge of the well. And before Ruvain's last breath went out of him, they paskind. Okay, that's obviously a pretty absurd case. Anyway, in other places, the Gemara actually speaks about milva ksuva b'torah k'chsuva b'shtar damya. That it could be that a debt that exists based on a Torah obligation, like paying for damages, it's like it exists in a document. Okay, but again, the question would still be, about like how now are you collecting from the heirs? So once more, Rav and Shmuel say that if there's no document, you don't collect from the heirs. Here it seems that you do. The Gemara gives a pretty absurd way to explain why they could collect from the heirs, according to Rav and Shmuel. Elsewhere, the Gemara might explain that it might be different because it's it's based on a debt that's in the Torah, as it were, the obligation to pay off for damages. Okay, and Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan hold something that goes against everything we know, and they say even without a document, you can always collect liens. As I said, the more reasonable middle position is that without a document, without a shtar, you can collect from the heirs, but not from the buyers.
So
Okay.
I'm trying to understand. Why don't they say like tiyuf or something? Sort of like, I mean, obviously it's
I don't know what to say. Amar Rav Papa, the Rav Papa says, Hilchasa top of Kafayin Vav and Aleph, the last daf of the Masechet. The halacha is Milvel Per Gova Mina Yorshim, the Eina Gova Mina Lukuchos, which is thank you, the reasonable position. Gova Mina Yorshim, Kadei Shelo Tinos Delas Bifnei Lovim. You collect from the heirs so as not to lock the door in front of lenders, even though you could say the lenders should have written a shtar if they wanted to protect their interests. Nevertheless, maybe, a guy dying and the heirs inheriting is a more natural thing and it's a regular thing, and therefore we want a lender to have a regular way of collecting, and maybe it's more fair that the heirs are paying the estate, their father's debt. So there we sort of say, in order to encourage people, we'll allow you to collect even if you didn't write a document, because it's from the heirs and they didn't put out any money. The Eina Government one minute, but you don't collect from the buyers, the Leisei Kala, because the buyers aren't, for the normal reasons, the buyers aren't protected. Now, is it clear how Rav Papa holds whether Shibud is Doraita or not Doraita?
Well, if it's Doraita, you would definitely be going in a Yorshin. And
No, not necessarily. Well, you are going in the Yoshim, yes. Okay, but it's not clear which way he holds. He gives a reason that could explain why we either took it away, why we removed basically Shibud is Doraita, but we removed it from when it's al pen from the Lekuchos to protect the Lekuchos, or basically Shibuda is Lav Doraita. Right, but we put it in the case of heirs. He gives a reason for both sides, so he's not taking a position on Kibuda D'Oraita. Tosfos points out that elsewhere the Gemara sort of sees this as maybe taking a position on that issue. If you look at Tosfos, government Yoshim Kedei Shalotinos Delas Bifnei Lovim, so it says Hachamuki Hachmil Saliba D'Chulei Alma. So this split that you collect from heirs with an oral thing and not from the purchasers, you can explain it wherever your point of departure is. Per Kamet Kiddushin, in government Yoshim Shibuda Doraisa. Etc. So the Gemara there sides with the position Shibuda D'Oraita, right, which makes sense. And to say, since Shibuda D'Oraita, fundamentally you're entitled to the heirs, and we're only going to, say you can't get it from the Lekuchos because we have to protect them. But we don't have to protect the heirs because the heirs aren't spending any money. All right. But there's a way you could sort of say, you can't box me in. This split decision, you get it from the heirs and not from the Lekuchos, could be explained according to either side. Yes.
Is the shtar a rabbinic invention?
The idea, so that's a good question. That's an excellent question. Is the idea of a shtar chov a rabbinic invention? The Gemara learns that, for example, that from the book of Yirmiyah, whatever, which is actually about a sale document of a field. It could be that the idea of a shtar which serves as an instrument for divorce, or an instrument for selling the land, effecting the transaction, those are D'Oraita. Certainly a get is, but a shtar that is purely written as a shtar raya, as a shtar that is to bring evidence to the fact that something occurred, right? It could be that is purely, there's a whole discussion of Ramban and Rambam. You've hit on a major debate of Rishonim. It could be that is only rabbinic, because biblically speaking, if you want testimony, you got to show up in court and give your testimony. And the idea that you're going to write a shtar whose whole purpose is to sort of make the testimony exist in writing without it being produced in and without being produced in a court, could be that is a rabbinic institution. That's debated. Well, shtar kinyan, a shtar that effects a change, a get, a writ of manumission to free a slave, a writ to buy a plot of land, a writ that would actually effect kiddushin. Kiddushin could be by shtar. Those are D'Oraita. Whether a shtar whose whole purpose is just to provide testimony, that is debatable whether that's D'Oraita or D'Rabbanan. Okay, but you're right here because you're saying if it's not here, we're assuming that the difference of a star is a rabbinic difference, and that's consistent with the idea that a star might be the whole star might be a rabbinic institution. That is a good point. Okay, so anyway, we had that very nice classic debate if shibud is doraita or not doraita. The nice important conclusion when it comes to heirs that even if it's not a star, you still have liens. Okay, without the Gemara concluding which side of the debate that comes down on. But as Tosfos points out from another Gemara, there's reason to think that that's more consistent with the idea that Shibuda is Dioraita, and therefore it'll exist even without a star in the case of the heirs, but it won't exist for the Lakuchos. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. If you have witnesses without a star, you don't have liens. And if you have a star without witnesses, you don't have liens. What's a star without witnesses? You've got the borrower's own handwritten IOU. So you can use that to collect from the borrower, but that doesn't create liens for the purchasers. So he asked from Rabbi, so what if the Ksav Yad was already established in Beis Din, which means Michael has this thing. I borrowed $1,000 from Dove, signed Michael Waxman. I go to a Beis Din and say, guys, can you go ahead and validate this signature for me and write your henpick, write your validation on it that says that you've seen that this is Michael's signature and you establish it. And now when it comes time to collect, I won't have to go through that whole process. And they, sure, Dove, no problem. And they go ahead, they validate the signature and they write their seal. Does that seal of Beis Din become now like Eidim on the star? And now it becomes Eidim on the star. I now have liens on Michael's property. You understand the question? Because I now got 3 people to validate Michael's signature. Okay? So I'm sorry. That does not create liens. Liens on it is not testified by witnesses. Now, one of the reasons might be not only because the Beis Din isn't functioning as witnesses to the original loan, but one of the reasons might be because it's coming after the loan and the document existed. Right, so it's like so it's not go. I mean, that's an interesting question, right? What if you sort of did it sort of after the shtar was already created? But anyway, but also they're not directly functioning like that. Okay, so he says, let me just read the Rashbam here. Okay, well, let's read a little bit more of the Gemara. Masiv Rabbi Barcham. So Rabbi Barcham asked on this. Shlusha gitin psulim v'nisis of lad kosher. There are 3 types of gitin which are rabbinically invalid, but b'diavad, if the woman gets married, we won't say that the kid is a mamzer. We'll recognize that it's legitimate. What are they? The eluhei. Ksav b'ksav yodo was handwritten by the husband. Ve'en olav eidim, and no witnesses are on it. Yesh olav eidim ve'en bozman, or there were witnesses, but there was no time in it. Or yesh bozman, or there were witnesses and a time written in or date, I should say, written in the document. Ve'en bo aled alcha, but there's really only one witness. So that's good, but if those are puzzle, but b'diavad, if the woman uses it, the child it's a good get, and the child is not a mom's here. Rabbi Linzer says, even if there were no witnesses, but it was given in front of witnesses, because Rabbi Linzer, you might remember, it was in Eidim Asir Karti, the witnesses who observe the star being handed over, the get being handed over, become the witnesses of the star. He says that would totally be kosher lichatchila. And not only that, and here's the line that's relevant for us, if it were not a get, but a star chov, and Michael handed me his document that he owes me $1,000, and there were no witnesses at all. It wasn't even his handwriting. He ran it off of his printer. Okay, but the 2 of you saw it. You become the witnesses in the star, and now I can collect. I have liens. So that's, by the way, a fascinating idea for Rabbi Linzer, because if the whole idea of a witness star is that it creates a kol, even though the star itself isn't signed, you guys just saw it being handed over, that creates a star that creates liens. Okay, that's Rabbi Lezer's position. Why is this relevant for us? Because we're assuming if when the 2 of you saw the star, even though it wasn't written in the star, the testimony, that creates liens. So when I go ahead and I take the star to a Beis Din and get the Beis Din to look at it and to validate it, then that's 3. That should certainly create liens if they validate it. Why should it be different? So the Gemara says it is different. So the Gemara says, no. Shani Hasam, the Mishas Ksiva, Hu Deshibeg Nafshe. No. There, the liens existed from the time the star was written. What does that mean? It means when you 2, Hanan and David, you witnessed Michael giving over the star, you are the witnesses in the document. So the star, when it first existed, when did the star first exist? When it was handed to me. That's when it gets the status of the star. When it's handed to the other side, it had documents. When it came into, it had witnesses. When it came into effect, it was a star with Eidim. That's the case when there was nothing written, but there were two witnesses present at the time. However, when Michael hands me his handwritten IOU, and I go an hour later to Beis Din and I knock on their door and I get them to validate it, the star became active without witnesses. And since it became active without witnesses, and the witnesses were only placed on later, then that is not a star that creates liens. Okay, do you understand? It's like a formalistic difference. We're not dealing with technically how public of a matter it is, but the star that creates liens is a star that was a star when it was turned into a star, when it was handed over to the other side. So even if the witnesses aren't written in and they're standing and observing, that's a star. However, if it's Michael's signature and the signature is validated later, but when it was handed to me, there was no witnesses in it, that is not a star and there are no liens as a result of it.
Dine star kind of thing?
Exactly. Okay. If you take a look at the Rashbam, for example, he says like this. The whole star, it's 1, 2, 3, about 7 lines down in the narrow lines. He says, the whole star milveh umechira shechosmin bo edim. If the star has witnesses in it, whether they're written in it or whether they exist in it because of Rabbi Lezer's idea of Edi Mesira Karti, Govin Mimshabdi, Ki'ilu Kosev Ben Achrayas, that you can use with liens, like it's written in. O Dilma, Kiyum Star Enamo, Yelishum Star, this is the question, but he'll articulate why it shouldn't work. O Dilma, Kiyum Star Enamo, Lishum Star, El Lachziko Bevesin, Lechemoshay Nikodem. All a validation does is it just says this is a good star, but it's not adding to its weight. It's recognizing that it was Michael's signature, but it doesn't give more weight to it than it had before. That you can't deny that it's your witnesses. Meaning, there's another way of emphasizing. What I was emphasizing was when the star became a star, did it have witnesses in it or not? Or the witnesses, like, I don't know, added later because the Beis Din signed later. But this is which is sort of a little bit the way the Gemara articulates it at the end, right? Was it Mishas Ksiva? When was the moment that the witnesses existed? But the other way of saying it is, the point of Beis Din validating is not to give it greater weight as a star. It's just to say this is not a forgery. It's allowing it to serve as the star that it was without it being challenged. But their signatures don't give it a different, a different weight than it had before. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Now we get to the last point, which is going back to the idea of a guarantor. If a guarantor signs after the witnesses, the position of Rabbi Shmuel was that the fact that he signs means that he's obligating himself, but there are no liens because there were no witnesses on his obligation didn't have witnesses on it. It was after the witnesses to the star. And then Benanis says, I'm going to assume from the fact that he signed afterwards that he only agreed to be an Arev after the money was loaned. And if that's true, then he's not obligated at all. Okay, with his very powerful illustration of somebody choking somebody.
Yesterday with it's on text and then it's underneath.
Yeah, that's the case. Yeah, here's my star. Use the same star I used yesterday. Okay, Michael owes Dolo $1,000, and here are the witnesses. And then afterwards it says, I, David, agreed to have been a guarantor for Michael, and David signs his name. Okay, so David's obligation doesn't have witnesses on it. So my right to collect from David doesn't come with liens on David's property. That's what Rabbi Shmuel says. But Benana says, the fact that you wrote it at the bottom of the star, I'm going to assume that meant that you had already lent Michael money, you had the star, you were then pressuring Michael to pay, and Michael didn't have the money, and David stepped in and agreed after the fact to be the guarantor. And then Benana says, if you agree to be an Arev after the fact, you're not obligated at all. Okay, so let's take a look at the Gemara. Amarav, Kodem Chisum Shtaros, Govim Minuchasim Mishubadim. If you write it before the witnesses sign, then it's like a star on the Arev himself, and then that gives you liens even on the Arev's property. La'achar Chisum Shtaros, if it's after the signatures, Govim Minuchasim Minei Chorim, then you get from unencumbered property, which is pretty much the straight psak of Rabbi Shmuel, just spelling it out. Zimni Mama Rav. Now there were times that Rav would say, even if you write it before the witnesses sign, it's never really a shtar on the arev. It's only a shtar against the lova. You never have liens. Now, kasha d'Rav ad so is Rav contradicting himself? So the Gemara says, no, lo kasha, it's not a contradiction. Had the kasabe ploni arev, had the kasabe uploni arev. So the shtar where it has that David is the guarantor, does it say, Michael borrowed $1,000 from Dove, and David agreed to be the guarantor, signatures? That means it's all one testimony, and the signatures are going on the entirety of the testimony, so it's also a shtar against David. If it says, Michael borrowed $1,000 from Dove, David is the guarantor, witnesses, then somehow I don't know, it's still a little bizarre. We say the witnesses are only testifying to the core part of the shtar, that Michael borrowed the money. David being the guarantor is not part of the direct testimony of the witnesses, which is a strange idea. Okay?
What was it, a different wording?
The Vav. You have, and David is the guarantor, which makes it one big statement, and the witnesses are testifying to everything. Then it's also a shtar against you. If there's no Vav, Michael borrowed $1,000, period. David is the guarantor, period. Signed and shown witnesses. Then we say it's only a shtar against Michael. It's not a shtar against David. Okay?
So then why are the witnesses signing after it says David is the guarantor?
I mean, maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's enough to prove that David owes the money, but not a formal shtar to give me leave. It's a strange idea. I don't understand it. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Rabbi Yochanan says, so even if it says, and David is the guarantor, it's not a shtar against David. So the Gemara says, even if it says, and so is the guarantor. See, that's not part of the testimony of the shtar, which is bizarre. What do you mean it's not part of the testimony of the shtar? So Masiv Rava. So Rava challenges. This is another strange idea. It says, here I am, I divorced my wife, I raised a gitech, whatever, that, you should go to Avi, you should go ahead and be Muteres Chol Adam, Minyama Dinan Olam. Oh, and by the way, say hi to Cheryl when you get a chance, okay? And then the witnesses sign it. So we say it's not a good get, because maybe all the witnesses were saying was, oh yeah, say hi to Cheryl for us also, okay? And maybe they weren't signing to the actual testimony of the get, which seems like a complete rabbinic concern. Like, how could you say such a thing? What does it mean to testify to, find out how Cheryl was doing? So it says, okay, it's so. The Amar Rabbi Yavo, and Rabbi Yavo said, no, that rule it, so anyway, so the question is, and he clarifies it. Where's Rabbi Yochanan here? So what's the problem? So the problem is that if in that case we say that the witnesses are going on the say hi part, so if you have, and David is an Arev, how could we say that the witnesses are not also going on that part of the shtar? Now, of course, there's a difference. In one case, you say maybe it was only going on the bottom part. Here we have to say it definitely was going on the part that referred to David in order to collect from David. But the point is that when we have something extraneous, and certainly David being a guarantor is not so extraneous written, we don't assume that the witnesses are not referring to that line that's in the document. So let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara says like this. Where were we? So it says, here's the explanation I for Rabbi Yochanan, why he says that the person never becomes a guarantor and how that's different than the get case. She'ilu puzzle. If I say, ask how Rachel, what did I say? Cheryl. Ask how Cheryl is doing, then it's puzzle. Then it's like a separate line. This she'ilu kosher. So, but if you say and ask, then it's kosher, then it's one testimony. So that's the difference between ploni arev, ploni arev. Now, by the way, it's not exactly the same, because here the question is, if you say, here's the case of the get, okay, and it says this ilu, and ask after whatever Rachel, and here's the signature or whatever Cheryl. Okay, then we say it's one unit and it's kosher. Right? And it's going on everything, and it's kosher. If you had it say, she'ilu, we would say it's 2 units. You have the get and you have the she'elat shalom. And it's puzzle because why? Because the witnesses are only going on that part, right? That's the get case. But in case of the array, if you have here the loan, and then you have uploni array, then you say it's all one thing, one, and it's all one big star, and there are shibudim, right? There are liens even on the arrays. If you have it like this, but here's the loan, and you said ploni array, what do you say? You're saying this is the star, right? So here you're saying the star is only the bottom to passel the get. Here you're saying the star obviously is the core part of it, is the top. By comparison, this should still be kosher because the signatures should still be going on the core part. So Tosfos points out, like, obviously this whole thing by get is a chumrah, okay? Because anyway, it's pretty absurd to say you're signing on she'elas shalom. But the point still being that if here we acknowledge a difference, that when it's one big thing, we're not going to passel the get, even though when it's 2 things, that we'll passel because we'll say maybe it's only going on the bottom. So certainly here, when you're dealing not with ask how Cheryl is doing, but you're saying David is a guarantor and you have a vav, obviously it should be one big star and it should create liens on David's property. So we're going to say enachinami. So the Gemara is going to say like this. So hachanami dekasiv ploni arev. You're right. So the case that Rabbi Yochanan says that it's not a lien against David is when it doesn't say and David, it just says David is the guarantor. So the Gemara says ihachi hainu derav. So that's the same thing Rav said. So Rabbi Yochanan is not saying, oh, no. Even in that case, you don't have liens. He's just saying the same thing Rav said. If you said ploni arev, you don't have liens. Ploni arev, you do. So it says, hainu derav. Fine. So say Rabbi Yochanan said the same thing as Rav. We thought Rabbi Yochanan, when he said you don't have liens, meant even if you had the vav, you don't have liens. And now we say, no, he's really just saying the same thing as Rav. Without the vav, it's a separate statement and you don't. With the vav, it's one statement and you do. Now again, even without the vav, it's hard to say that the witnesses are not testifying to the fact that you are the guarantor. And presumably, I can use the star to force you to pay. It certainly is evidence to that. The question is, does it have the status of a star vis-a-vis you? Since it primarily was written vis-a-vis Michael and to create liens on Michael's property, do I say that it functions not only as proof, but as a star vis-a-vis you to create liens on your property? And there, as long as there's some break and it's not a vav that's wrapping it all together, we'll say that it won't be a star against you. It might be that we just make that difference in order to help protect the poor guarantor. He's already doing this nice act of of being nice and stepping up to the plate. Maybe we want to limit the cases that he's really going to be like fully exposed. I understand, but and also right, how much do the lekuchos, they were trying to protect the lekuchos, how much do they find out that not only that this guy, not that he borrowed money, but he was a guarantor for somebody else's loans, and I have to be careful about buying his property, right? So it might be we're trying to protect the lekuchos more as well. Also, okay. Now the message like
know the difference between ploni array versus ploni array.
Right. I know. So I'm saying that to me seems very like a hair splitting thing. I could make a formalistic difference, but I'm wondering again if there's some policy that's driving it about trying to protect the lekuchos more in that case. Let's wrap up. Umaysa ba lifnei Rabbi Yishmael. Now here was the story that the case came for Rabbi Yishmael. The signature was at the bottom after the witnesses. He said, okay, there's no liens, but at least the Arev is liable. And Ben Nana says the Arev isn't even liable. And says, why not? So he gave this very powerful image of somebody was choking somebody, said, Michael, pay me up my loan. And David said, leave him alone, I'll agree to pay you. So it says David is just doing it to stop me from pressuring Michael. He doesn't really need to obligate himself. So if he signed at the bottom of the star, we'll assume that means that he agreed to pay after I lent money to Michael. And since that's what it is, he's really not obligating himself to me. Okay, that's what Ben Nana says. So the Gemara says like this. Right. I'm a Rabbi Bar Chanan Rabbi Yochanan. Avo pi shekilis Rabbi Shmuel's Ben Nanas. So then Rabbi Shmuel ended by saying, if you want to become smart, learn Dinei Mammidus, and actually use the nice language of business. If you want to go into a good business of learning Torah, the way you make good money or good Torah out, good chachma from learning is go into the learning of Dinei Mammidus. And if you want to learn Dinei Mammidus well, you should apprentice yourself to Ben Nanas. He was such a powerful image. So he says, even though he was praising Ben Nanas, Halacha kamosa. We rule like Rabbi Shmuel that if you sign after the witnesses, you do obligate yourself. There are no liens, but you do obligate yourself, even if you agree to be an arev after the money was lent out. Ibailu. Now they ask the question. B'chonuk mali amar Rabbi Shmuel. Let's say it was literally a case, not just a metaphor or whatever, or not just an analogy, but here I am, I'm literally choking Michael, okay? And David runs in and he says, no, I'll be an arev, okay? Would Rabbi Shmuel say there too, he's obligated, right?
I think I need to change seats here now.
Okay, so Toshma, come here. The Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Choluk haya Rabbi Shmuel af b'chonuk. Nope, yet Rabbi Shmuel would say, even if I was choking Michael, once David agrees to be an arev, he's an arev no matter what reasons are motivating him. Which is interesting if you think about yesterday. Well, besides which, well, I'm not being told a date, but whatever. But if you think about yesterday, the idea that if somebody is agreeing to be an arev for ksuva, he's not obligated because he's just trying to get the couple married, right? So it would seem this would be a similar point. I mean, but maybe it's like a low plug. We can't go figuring out what were the different things that motivated David. At the end of the day, he agrees to be an arev, he's liable. Okay, so now the Gemara says, okay, now halacha kamoso or ain't halacha kamoso? Fine. Now, do we rule like Rabbi Shmuel in the case of when the lova is being literally choked? Right? Fine. Rabbi Shmuel would say that yes, even in that case he's liable. But do we rule that way? So Toshma, come in here. Chiyasa Rabbi and Rabbi Yochanan. When Rabbi came from Israel, he said the name of Yochanan. Cholukai Rabbi Shmuel af b'chanuk. Rabbi Shmuel would disagree with Benanis even when the guy is being choked and say that the arev does obligate himself. V'alacha kamosa af b'chanuk, and we rule that way, which again makes it interesting compared to the case of the ksuva. But maybe say like low plug, we can't go ahead and figure out every single case what motivated the guarantor, and once the guarantor agrees, he's liable. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Chanuk v'kanu miyado. Now we're trying to pull back. If the guy was being choked, meaning and the guarantor stepped in, then the guarantor only obligates himself if he did a kinyan to show how serious he was, like the handkerchief. Okay, mishtabed. Okay, michlal the arev ba'amal lo by kinyan. In a normal case, a guarantor does not need a kinyan. Just verbally, he obligates himself. We referred to this before, but literally, the Gemara waited to the last two lines of the Masechet to discuss what is the act that obligates the arev. Is it verbal, or does he need to do a kinyan? So here it sounds like he only needs to do a kinyan if he steps in at the last minute because the guy's being choked, whether literally or figuratively. But otherwise, verbally would be enough. So the Gemara says, Michlal, the Arev Dama lo by kinyan. Who pleaded Rav Nachman. That argues on Rav Nachman. Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, Arev the Beistin, hu de lo by kinyan. If the guy agrees to be an Arev and it's being somehow supervised or assigned by the court, I'm not exactly sure what that role is, then the fact that the court is giving you that role gives enough weight to it and maybe makes you take it sort of serious because you're honored by the court to take this role, then you're obligated even without a kinyan. But normally an arev, yes, even an arev who is a normal arev and not at the time that the guy's being pressured, maybe even at the time of the loan. With the one exception of a court-appointed arev, you need a kinyan. So now we have a kinyan is needed all the time, or kinyan is needed if the arev steps in at the last minute, or steps in whatever, after the guy's being pressured. And now let's see the conclusion of the Gemara. The Hilchasa, Michael can be very happy that the second ends with the Hilchasa. The Hilchasa, Arev b'shas matan mos lo by kinyan. If you're when the money is being lent, verbally is enough. This is like the difference we made before, because then obviously the money is being lent because of your say so, and you really are taking the responsibility because David said he would guarantee is why I am willing to lend money to Michael. So that really creates a serious weight of responsibility on David. He's obligating himself even just verbally there. Okay. Right. Afterwards, where I've already lent the money, it's not relying on him. He's maybe just doing it to stop me from forcing Michael and pressuring him. Boy, kinyan. That needs a kinyan. That's like the first statement of the Gemara, that the kinyan is needed only in the benanis type of the case, when David steps in after the money has been lent. Okay, Arev de Beistin and Arev Beistin, low by kinyan, doesn't need a kinyan whenever the person is assigned as an Arev through the court. By that pleasure that he gets, and he knows that he's trusted by Beistin, he agrees to take that role, whether even just verbally, even without a kinyan. Hadralach get Pashat Basikalach B'Seches Bava Basra. So Yishkalach to everybody, and finishing Bava Basra and all of Seder Nezikin. And tomorrow we begin Sanhedrin, and we will be doing it with a little Yerushalmi. So we're going to be starting with Yerushalmi Mishulav. I'll send out like the Yerushalmi text, or I'll make copies. Okay, we'll start with that. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, we'll see you all tomorrow. Take care. Okay.
Be a great scene. The guy's been strangled.
Yeah.
Wait, you have a handkerchief?
Yeah, handkerchief out to the kinyan. Right. Okay.
Okay, so then.